Last week, SciShow released a video called What is the Autism Spectrum? But what do actually autistic people think? This video is a response compiling various reactions outlining the good, the bad, the absolutely cringeworthy, and the quite frankly actually very refreshing. Hi everyone, Paul Micallef here from Autism from the Inside. I make weekly videos sharing the human side of autism, so make sure you hit subscribe to get the latest content. So how did SciShow's recent video land in the autism community? It's still early days, so we'll get a better sense as more and more people see the video, but I can summarize the responses I've seen so far in 2 words. Good, but. Or perhaps slightly more accurately, if you'll allow me to use more than 2 words, not bad, at least not as bad as lots of stuff we've seen in the past, but still quite a few bones to pick, especially regarding one extremely controversial issue that we'll get to later. Firstly though, let me read you some of the initial feedback this What is the Autism Spectrum video has already received. Some said, I thought it was factual, clear and even-handed. Or another, I found the overall scientific part of the video good, but it starts to break down in the second half. I'm just happy y'all didn't use the puzzle piece for a thumbnail. I'm an Indigenous woman and was not diagnosed until my late 20s. I'm usually nervous about watching videos about autism, but this one was very well done. Thank you. It's trying very hard to include diversity early on and doesn't do a bad job in the beginning. But it immediately jumps to and only talks about diagnosis, disorder, and symptoms, even though it keeps emphasizing that autism is a spectrum. As someone with ASD, thank you for treating this topic with the respect and technical clarity it deserves. I feel like there was an attempt to be fair and inclusive. Ultimately, I thought this video was cringe and I did not feel seen nor empowered. This is the best comprehensive summary of autism I have seen. Thank you for making it. I feel very misunderstood by what most people think autism is. Most treatments seem to be about trying to help autistic people fit their square peg into the round hole. How about working with us instead of trying to make us like you are? For the most part, I thought this video was a very good and comprehensive introduction, up until the point where he mentioned interventions. Again, perpetuating the dangerous position of trying to correct behaviour. So this latter comment about being uncomfortable with the interventions part of the video was pretty common, and there were lots of complaints regarding controversial therapies, which we'll look at later. So obviously not all views have been represented here, but hopefully you're getting a sense of the overall sentiment and some common reactions. As you can see, a lot of the positive feedback has a little bit of a "this is so much better than the I'm used to" kind of vibe to it, which is unfortunately quite telling of the autistic experience historically up to this point. So let's get into some more detail. It's easy to criticize, so let's start with the positive. What did they do really well? Before taking a look at some of the more seriously problematic aspects, and finishing with an explanation of the cringe factor that was mentioned before. So I'm happy to report that I have lots of really positive things to say about this What is the Autism Spectrum video. Firstly, as many people have pointed out, it takes a very balanced, scientific, evidence-based approach, which is clear and factual, and avoids the doom and gloom scare tactics that we've seen in the past in previous attempts to raise awareness about autism. So what else? There was a genuine effort to be inclusive and acknowledge the diversity of the spectrum. There was an effort to emphasize difference as opposed to only talking about deficits. There were good examples explaining things like the double empathy problem, as illustrated by the telephone game. And the video also directly dispelled some common myths that are unfortunately still reasonably prevalent in the community. Myths like very limiting stereotypes about what autism can look like or who can have it. Myths about savants, or that autism is extremely rare, or that it's something you grow out of. Debunking the idea that autism is only a white person's diagnosis. Challenging the idea that a communication difference is always a communication deficit. And of course, being really clear on the overwhelming scientific consensus surrounding vaccines. So for all these reasons, many commenters seem to agree that this video was better than most, or at the very least, better than some of the horrific examples we've seen in the past of people trying to raise awareness around autism. Another way of thinking about this is that our understanding of autism has come a very long way in the last 10 years or so, and this video captures a lot of that. But, yes, and here comes the but, you knew it was coming, it also propagates several more unhelpful myths. Another way of thinking about it could be that the video takes one really solid step in a good direction, and then stops, jettisoning some unhelpful, outdated beliefs and keeping others. And the end result is this good but type of response that we seem to be getting at the moment. So why do some autistic people get this unseen, disempowered feeling? Let's take a look at some of the more problematic aspects. So I'll get into specifics with examples in a minute, but let me just quickly give you an overview of the general sense of some of the most criticized content. So in the beginning, there's a bit of a nod to diversity and difference, fantastic, but then it jumps straight back into symptoms and deficits and causes. A large amount of the video is dedicated to speculative, unproven theories that show at best a correlation with the diagnosis of autism. It's easy to see that we're way off proving any kind of causal link, but that distinction was kind of glossed over for the most part. Secondly, neurodiversity was not mentioned at all. How can you attempt to answer the question, what is the autism spectrum, without even mentioning the best theory that explains it? Even if you don't agree with the theory, we could at least mention it. And finally, symptoms, behavior, intervention, all of these things are spoken about through the deficit model. Let's fix the broken autistic person. This is an explicitly outdated framework. We used to measure the success of autism therapies and interventions by this goal of helping children to become indistinguishable from their peers. That was literally the stated goal of the therapy. And it is now universally, as far as I know, recognized that that is not an appropriate goal. But the legacy from that era still haunts us when we talk about fixing deficits and correcting behavior. The so-called deficit or behavior is measured against social norms, a fact that the medical model of disability does not take into account. So let's get specific about some of these things. About a quarter of this 20-minute video is dedicated to discussing genes and causes of autism. And as we'll see later, if you incorporate what we've learned from the neurodiversity paradigm, looking for the cause of autism is actually the wrong question to ask. So it's not so much that there's a problem with the answer, but there are issues and unhelpful assumptions built into the question itself. Let's look at the evidence presented around genetic changes, for example. He said that in a 2019 study, most of the participants had no clinically relevant genetic changes. Okay, good. So most of the participants had no relevant genetic changes. About 10% of them had at least one, and they were not all the same. The study found over 200 genetic changes that are likely to be involved in creating the autistic experience. So let's pause and take that in for a second. 90%, that's a high percentage, of the thousands of autistic people in this study had no statistically significant genetic changes. And instead of coming to the conclusion, oh, well, maybe studying genes is not going to be as helpful as we thought it was, instead we focus on the only 10% of people who seem to match the original assumption that we can learn something by studying the difference in gene changes. And even then, when we follow that rabbit hole, we don't get anywhere useful. If your car was making a funny noise and you took it to the mechanic, and the mechanic said, good news, we've done a research study on thousands of cars, and we found that 10% of them could have their funny noise explained by any one of 200 factors. Fantastic. So what does that say about my car and my funny noise? Not much. But there's actually a much, much bigger issue here. The bigger issue is that this type of research still receives a huge amount of funding today at the expense of research that might actually improve the lives of autistic people. He says, you better believe that scientists are still looking into it. In the last few years, the National Institutes of Health started pushing for autism research and funded a veritable buttload of projects along those lines. This is not a tiny little theoretical or semantic issue. When we ask unhelpful questions rooted in paradigms that we've already shown to be highly problematic, then we have autism charities raising money supposedly to help autistic people and instead funding this type of research. We already know that the autistic condition is extremely complex and diverse. It's likely made up of the overlap of lots of different things, and it most definitely does not have one cause. If we understood that, for example, if we started with the neurodiversity paradigm, we'd be much more likely to ask more helpful questions. Fortunately, I think this is improving significantly these days. In Australia, at least, there's a significant push to ensure that research questions actually align with what the community thinks would be valuable. And thankfully, there's a really good example of that right in the middle of SciShow's video. It wasn't explicitly named, but that game of telephone example is an explanation of what's called the double empathy problem, a concept created by Dr. Damien Milton, an actually autistic researcher from the University of Kent in England. He had the idea that what if autistic communication was not a deficit, what if it's a difference? And now we have scientific research to back up his idea. To quote the SciShow video again, "This is a huge finding that flies in the face of years of clinicians and researchers claiming that autistic people have a communication deficit." And where does it come from? An actually autistic researcher. Anyway, there are lots of other things we could discuss. For example, the explanation of what a spectrum is was not quite accurate. It kind of confused two different ideas together. The term nonverbal autism is also used quite a lot in the video, and my experience is that many advocates prefer the term non-speaking as it's a lot more descriptive. The diagnosis section also neglects a lot of important issues such as the prevalence of misdiagnosis and the lack of expertise among professionals. But I can't cover absolutely everything. Sometimes I need to rein in my attention for detail for practical reasons. So let's stick to the big stuff, which leads us to the most significant piece of feedback, the most cringeworthy section of the whole video. There is one line in this video that I am sure will get under the skin of many, many people. It's perhaps the most misleading statement in the whole video. He says, "For all its flaws, applied behavioral analysis is regarded as the only effective evidence-based intervention for someone on the spectrum." That is misleading, to say the least. ABA, applied behavioral analysis, is insanely controversial. It is difficult to overestimate how controversial this type of therapy is. He also says some people who have undergone applied behavioral analysis found it extremely unpleasant. Yes, and if you look a bit closer, many people who have undergone ABA describe their experience as abuse. There are large sections of the autistic community who are vehemently opposed to this type of therapy or anything even resembling it. I feel that's important, and I don't feel it was emphasized in the initial video. So let's look very briefly at why the SciShow could in good conscience make a statement like this, and the greater context that leads so many in the autistic community to be so vehemently opposed. Firstly, technically, behavioral-based methods are extremely effective at achieving their goals. They are very easy to measure, very easy to standardize and implement, and they therefore have an extremely large evidence base to lean on. The controversy is not about if it's effective or not, it's precisely around the goals of the therapy itself. He showed a quote, "Even 10 hours of training per week showed larger behavioral change." In other words, behavior training, behavior change. That's what's being measured. If you would like to teach a child to hug you, then a very effective method is to electrify the floor, and when they don't hug you, they get an electric shock. I did not make this up. This actually happened in the early days of behavior research. Success. The client has shown improvement in their ability to hug me. Obviously, those types of extremes are not used today. But if we take a less extreme example, behavioral change might be, can I teach this child to look me in the eye? And the answer is behavioral therapy, behavioral training is very effective in creating behavioral change. The child now looks me in the eye, and all it took was more modern forms of reward and punishment. Now, here is the really, really, really big problem with that entire approach. And partly it's the problem because it looks like it is working so well on the outside. Let's take the same example, and the therapist notes down, good, improvement, has looked me in the eye. And actually, what you've taught that child to do is to mask their own autistic behavior and replace that behavior with what's considered socially appropriate. Here's why that's important. The outcome of that is that the child will now no longer receive the support that they need. Difference is masked, disability is masked, social challenges are masked. Great, no problem anymore. Except that when I'm looking the teacher in the eye, I'm not absorbing any of the information. And now everyone thinks I'm dumb. And socially, I'm not making any friends because I'm putting all of my effort into looking people in the eye. But the worst part is that because the rest of society doesn't see the challenge, the individual gets no more help. So you can potentially see why some in the community might react to statements like, the younger children were when they started interventions, the more improvement they showed. It really, really matters what we consider improvement to be. As you can see, that's a huge topic, so I won't go into too much more detail. But in order to understand why certain members of the autistic community might react very strongly to this section of the video, it helps to have a bit of context as to how these issues can significantly affect the trajectory of our lives. If we back up for a minute though, this issue I've been describing is actually a problem with the entire paradigm of the medical model. What is this so-called improvement that we are trying to achieve? When you force a square peg into a round hole, you damage the peg. When we try to force an autistic person into a neurotypical mold, we damage the autistic person. A common saying that some people really like is, I don't suffer from autism, I suffer from other people. Now, is it unfair to criticize a science show for failing to talk about significant social aspects? No, I don't think so. If you're trying to answer the question, what is the autism spectrum? We need to include the social aspect of the disability. Sure, there are also physical aspects of autism, but the core linking them all together is what has been historically described as a deficit in social aspects. Things like communication, social reciprocity, etc. How can you understand those things divorced from the social world? This is why we have new concepts like the social model of disability and the neurodiversity paradigm to put autism, previously thought of as a mystery, into a larger context where it can be understood. So if the creators of SciShow are watching this, firstly, thank you for progressing the understanding of autism in mainstream culture. I hope I made it clear in the beginning that your video is ultimately a really good step in a positive direction, but ultimately we have a long way to go. And I hope people have found the feedback in this video valuable in that regard. What I would actually love to see is a new video on what is neurodiversity, helping people take the next step away from the antiquated medical model of oversimplified cause and effect to progress our understanding of our own neurobiology with a more complex systems-oriented lens that takes all relevant factors into account. So I hope this response is well received by the SciShow folks. Please reach out if you want, especially if you're going to take my suggestion of doing a What is Neurodiversity video seriously. But otherwise, I think I should really leave it there for today. I have no idea how long this video is already, but it's probably likely longer than the initial video I'm supposed to be doing a response for. So that's clearly a sign to wrap up. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it valuable, and I will see you again next week. Bye. So what did you think? Did I miss anything? Do you agree? Did you have a different response? Make sure you have your say in the comments and we can keep the discussion going.